Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to crack open some really fascinating psychology studies, the kind that have really kind of shaped the way we think about the human mind.
It's amazing how research from decades ago, can still feel so relevant today. It really speaks to the enduring mysteries of the human experience.
It makes you realize we're still kind of grappling with so many of the same questions about who we are, why we do the things we do.
Absolutely. And, sometimes these studies, they offer more questions than answers, which is part of what makes psychology so fascinating.
All right, so first up, split brain research. Sperry and Gazanika's work. This just blew my mind in college.
I know, it's such a fascinating area. The idea that we could each have like two minds in one head.
Right, so they worked with these patients who had the connection between their brain hemispheres severed.
And what they found is that each hemisphere seems to specialize in different tasks.
Like how the left side is often better with language and logic, and the right side is more visual and creative.
Exactly. And sometimes it's like these hemispheres aren't even on the same page.
Yeah, I remember reading about that one patient who could verbally identify an object, but like their left hand would point to something totally
It's
different.
wild. Like part of their brain knew what the object was, but another part couldn't communicate that knowledge.
Right. It really makes you wonder, like, how often our own two hemispheres might be disagreeing with each other.
It definitely challenges our ideas about what it means to have a unified self. It's like, are we really just one person, or are we a collection of different selves all kind of competing for control?
That's a really good point. I like that. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about how our experiences can actually change the physical structure of our brains. And I'm thinking here about Rosenzweig, Bennett, and Diamond, and their studies with rats in these enriched environments.
Yeah, their work was groundbreaking. They basically raised one group of rats in a really stimulating environment, with all kinds of toys and challenges, and then another group in a plain old boring cage.
So one group got rat Disneyland, and the other group got, like, rat prison.
Pretty much. And what they found is that the rats with the richer experiences, those rats actually developed bigger, heavier brains.
Wait, are you serious? So just by giving them more to do and more to experience, their brains literally grew?
It's true, especially in the cortex, which is the area of the brain responsible for like higher level thinking and decision making.
That's incredible. What does that tell us about the importance of early childhood experiences for humans?
I think it really underscores the idea that our brains are constantly being shaped by our interactions with the world, right? Just like those rats, children who are exposed to more enriching environments with tons of opportunities to learn and explore, they have a much better chance of reaching their full potential.
Okay, so basically use it or lose it, but for your brain,
Yeah.
I'm definitely thinking about this now when I interact with my nieces and nephews.
That's great. And it's something to keep in mind for all of us, really.
And speaking of nature versus nurture, we can't forget Bouchard and Likens' twin studies.
Oh, yes. Those fascinating studies of identical twins who were separated at birth and then raised in completely different environments.
It's like nature's perfect experiment, right? To see just how much of who we are is predetermined by our genes.
Exactly. And what they found is that genetics seems to play a much bigger role than many people might expect.
I remember reading about those twins who'd never met, but they had the same weird habits, like wearing the same style of hat or sneezing 3 times in a row.
It's those kinds of stories that make you wonder about the power of genes, but we also have to remember it's not a deterministic view.
So we're not just puppets controlled by our DNA.
Not at all. Environment still shapes us too. It's that complex interaction between nature and nurture that makes each of us unique.
So it's like a dance between our genes and our experiences.
Totally.
Let's talk about babies. I've always been fascinated by how much they're taking in even before they can talk. You know, Gibson and Walk's visual cliff experiment is a great example of that.
Yeah, that one's a classic. They wanted to see if babies had an innate understanding of depth perception.
So they built this platform with a glass surface that looked like a drop-off, even though it was totally safe.
And they found that even babies who were just starting to crawl were hesitant to cross over that visual cliff.
Like they instinctively knew it was dangerous, even though they hadn't had any bad experiences with heights yet.
Exactly. It suggests that we're born with at least some basic understanding of depth and danger, which makes sense. From an evolutionary perspective, you wouldn't want your baby just crawling off a cliff.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
But so does that mean we're all born with like a full-blown fear of heights?
Not necessarily. It seems like the ability to perceive depth might be innate, but the emotional response of fear that's probably shaped by experience and learning.
So it's another example of nature and nurture working together.
Exactly. Our genes give us the building blocks, but our experiences are what really shape the final structure.
That's a great way to put it. So we've got the hardware, but the software gets updated as we go along.
Yeah.
Okay, speaking of babies, I remember that Fance's preferential looking technique, just the idea that we can figure out what babies are thinking by tracking what they look at.
It's such a simple yet brilliant idea. It turns out babies have preferences from the get-go. They love looking at faces, for example.
Which makes sense, right? Because faces are so important for social interaction even before a baby can understand language. They're picking up on all those nonverbal cues from faces.
Absolutely. Faces are packed with information about emotions, intentions, and babies are wired to tune into those signals.
It makes me wonder if those early face-to-face interactions are actually helping to wire the brain for social and emotional development.
That's a great question, and one that researchers are still exploring, but it definitely highlights the importance of those early interactions.
Now, this next one is more about how we categorize the world around us. Roche's work on natural categories. It kind of challenged some of those traditional ideas about how we form concepts.
Right, like how do we decide what belongs in a certain category? Do we have these strict definitions in our heads, or is it more flexible than that?
Right, like what makes a bird a bird? Is it just anything that can fly?
Well, Roche found that we tend to use prototypes, the most typical or representative examples of a category, to guide our thinking.
So like a robin is a more birdy bird than a penguin.
Exactly. Even though they're both technically birds, the robin more closely matches our prototype of what a bird should be.
So it's like our brains are creating these mental shortcuts to help us process information quickly.
And those shortcuts can be really helpful, but they can also lead to biases.
Right, because we might be more likely to notice or remember things that fit our preconceived notions, even if they're not entirely accurate.
Exactly. And that can have real-world consequences when it comes to things like stereotypes and prejudice.
So it's important to be aware of those mental shortcuts and how they can influence our thinking. Okay, so let's step into the mysterious world of hypnosis now.
Oh, hypnosis is always a fun one. Is it a real altered state of consciousness or just clever stagecraft? Spanos had some interesting thoughts on that.
Yeah, so Spanos basically argued that a lot of what we see in hypnosis can be explained by the power of suggestion and expectation.
Like people are playing a role and they want to do it well, even if they're not consciously aware of it.
So it's not that hypnosis is fake. It's just that maybe we've been misinterpreting what's really going on.
It speaks to the incredible power of our minds and how suggestible we can be, especially in certain contexts.
All right, so for something a little lighter, let's talk about Skinner's pigeons and those hilarious superstitious rituals they developed.
Oh yes, the pigeons who thought they had to dance to make the food appear.
So Skinner designed this experiment where the pigeons received food at random intervals, regardless of what they were doing.
But some of the pigeons started associating those random food deliveries with whatever they happened to be doing at the time, like bobbing their heads or turning in circles.
And then they started doing those things over and over again as if it was causing the food to appear, even though it was totally random.
It's classic superstitious behavior, and it shows how easily we can start to see patterns and connections even when they don't really exist.
Well, we like to think we're logical creatures, but sometimes we're just like those pigeons bobbing our heads for no reason.
Exactly. We're always looking for ways to control the uncontrollable, and sometimes that leads to some pretty funny and sometimes even harmful behaviors.
Now, switching gears to a more serious topic. Bandura's Bobo doll experiment revealed some pretty disturbing things about aggression in children.
Oh, that experiment is so powerful and so unsettling. The kids who watched adults aggressively attack a Bobo doll were much more likely to mimic that behavior themselves.
So just by observing someone else being aggressive, those kids learn to be aggressive too.
It's a sobering reminder of how easily we can pick up behaviors from our environment, especially as children.
Absolutely. It really highlights the importance of modeling positive behaviors and being mindful of what we expose children to.
And not just children, really. We all learn from watching others throughout our lives.
Okay, so our next study is all about expectations and how they can actually shape reality. I'm talking about Rosenthal and Jacobson's Pygmalion in the classroom study.
Ah, the classic self-fulfilling prophecy study. They randomly selected a group of students and told their teachers that those students were expected to show exceptional intellectual growth.
And guess what? Those students actually did show greater improvement over the course of the year.
It was like the teachers' expectations created this reality where those students actually thrived.
So just by believing in those students, the teachers created an environment where those students could excel.
It's a powerful reminder that our beliefs about ourselves and others can have a real impact on our behavior and our outcomes.
If someone believes in you, you're more likely to believe in yourself too.
It's true. We need to be careful about the expectations we set, both for ourselves and for others, because they can really become self-fulfilling prophecies.
All right, so let's move on to intelligence. Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences really challenged the traditional view that there's just one way to be smart.
Absolutely. He argued that we have all these different types of intelligence, like linguistic, musical, spatial, and interpersonal intelligence, just to name a few.
It's like we each have our own unique blend of strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. We all have our own ways of being smart.
This theory always resonated with me because it explains why some people might struggle in traditional academic settings but excel in other areas like art or music or athletics.
And by recognizing and nurturing these different intelligences, we can create learning environments that are more inclusive and engaging for everyone.
Speaking of learning Tolman's rat maze experiments, those show that even rats can create mental maps of their environment.
Yeah, they weren't just blindly following a set of learned behaviors. They were actively thinking about their surroundings and using those mental maps to solve
So
problems.
those little rats had more going on upstairs than we might think.
It's fascinating. And it makes you wonder how much more complex our own mental maps must be given our capacity for abstract thought and language.
I'm definitely thinking twice about those rats now. Now, for a topic that's a little unsettling. The fallibility of Memory Loftus's work on the misinformation effect is a real eye-opener.
Oh, absolutely. She showed how easily our memories can be distorted by leading questions or the introduction of new information.
It's like our memories are less like a video recording and more like a story we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
And each time we tell that story, it can change a little bit.
And that can have huge implications for things like eyewitness testimony. It's a reminder that our memories aren't always as reliable as we think they are.
Speaking of memories and how they form Harlow's studies with baby monkeys, those were heartbreaking. But they really highlighted the crucial role of contact comfort in early development.
Those images of the baby monkeys clinging to the soft cloth mothers, even though the wire mothers provided food, they're just seared into my memory.
It's like they were craving that physical touch and emotional connection even more than they craved food.
It shows how fundamental love and affection are for healthy development. Those early bonds are essential for our emotional and social well-being.
Okay, so our next study takes us back to the master of child development, Piaget. His observations of infants reveal so much about the stages of cognitive development and that fascinating concept of object permanence.
Object permanence is such a game changer for babies. It's that understanding that things continue to exist even when we can't see them.
I love that example of peekaboo. Before babies develop object permanence, they really think you've disappeared when you cover your face.
And then suddenly they get it. It's like a light bulb goes off and they realize that things don't just vanish into thin air.
Okay, let's explore the development of our moral compass. Now, Kohlberg's research outlined those different stages of moral reasoning.
He argued that our sense of right and wrong, it's not just about following rules or avoiding punishment, it's about developing a deeper understanding of ethical principles.
So it's like our morals evolve as we mature and encounter new ethical dilemmas.
Exactly. And that evolution is influenced by our experiences, our relationships, and the values we're exposed to.
So it's another example of that complex interplay between nature and nurture.
Right.
But this next one is about the importance of choice and control, especially for older adults. Langer and Roden's nursing home study is pretty
I've
fascinating.
found that giving residents even small choices like what to eat or how to decorate their room can have a huge impact on their well-being.
It's like having a sense of control over your own life can really boost your mood and even your physical health.
Absolutely. And that's true for all of us, not just older adults. We all need to feel like we have some agency in our lives.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about sex masters. And Johnson's research really revolutionized our understanding of human sexual response.
Their work was so groundbreaking and so controversial at the time.
They basically mapped out the 4 phases of sexual response, excitement, plateau orgasm, and resolution.
They helped to dispel so many myths and misconceptions about sex, and their research paved the way for more open and informed conversations about sexuality.
And it also led to the development of effective treatments for sexual dysfunctions, which has really helped countless people.
It was truly pioneering work. Now let's dive into the world of nonverbal communication. Ekman's cross-cultural studies, those revealed something really interesting about facial expressions.
I remember learning about this in college. It's the idea that facial expressions of emotion are pretty much universal.
Exactly. He found that people from all over the world, regardless of their language or culture, they all tend to recognize the same facial expressions as conveying the same emotions.
So a smile means happiness, and a frown means sadness no matter where you go in the world.
It suggests that our ability to read emotions and faces, it's not something we learn, it's something that's hardwired into us.
It makes sense, right? From an evolutionary perspective, being able to quickly and accurately read those emotional cues would have been essential for survival.
It would have helped our ancestors to avoid danger, build alliances, and cooperate with each other.
Okay, this next study is about that feeling we get when our thoughts and actions don't line up, cognitive dissonance. Festinger and Carl Smith's experiment really demonstrated how we try to rationalize our behavior to reduce that feeling of discomfort.
Oh, yes, I remember that one. They had participants do a really boring task, and then they paid them either a small amount or a large amount of money to lie and tell someone else that the task was actually fun.
And the people who were paid a small amount, they actually ended up convincing themselves that the task wasn't so bad after all.
It's wild, right? To avoid feeling like hypocrites, they actually change their attitudes to align with their behavior.
It's like our brains are always trying to maintain this sense of consistency, even if it means twisting the facts a bit.
Exactly, and it's something we all do to some extent.
Speaking of beliefs, Rotter's research on locus of control explored how our beliefs about control can influence our lives.
It's that classic question of, do we believe we're in control of our own destiny, or are we just at the mercy of fate?
Right, so people with an internal locus of control, they believe that their actions and choices have a direct impact on their lives, while people with an external locus of control, they feel like things just happen to them.
And research has shown that people with an internal locus of control tend to be more proactive, more resilient, and more likely to achieve their goals.
It makes sense, right? If you believe you have the power to change things, you're more likely to take action and make those changes happen.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of fostering a sense of agency and self-efficacy.
Now let's talk about gender roles.
Yay!
Bem's research on androgyny really challenged the traditional view that masculinity and femininity are two opposite ends of a spectrum.
She argued that we can all possess both masculine and feminine qualities, and that embracing those qualities can lead to greater flexibility and well-being.
It's like having more tools in your toolbox.
Yeah.
Right? You can be assertive and strong when you need to be, but also nurturing and compassionate in other situations.
Exactly. And it's about valuing those qualities in ourselves and in others, regardless of gender.
Okay, so our next study is about those high-strung type A personalities. The ones who are always on the go and super competitive. Friedman and Rosamond's research actually linked those type A behavior patterns to an increased risk of heart disease.
They found that type A individuals tend to have higher levels of stress hormones, and they're more prone to experiencing those fight or flight responses.
So it's not just about lifestyle choices like diet and exercise. Our personalities and how we handle stress can actually have a big impact on our physical health.
It's a reminder that managing stress and finding healthy coping mechanisms is crucial for our overall well-being.
Now let's broaden our perspective a bit and talk about culture. Triandes's work on individualistic and collectivist cultures is fascinating.
He explored how different cultures emphasize different values, like individual achievement versus group harmony.
So individualistic cultures like those in North America, they tend to value independence and self-reliance, while collectivist cultures, those in many parts of Asia, they prioritize interdependence and the well-being of the group.
It's important to remember that there's no right or wrong way to be. These are just different cultural values, and understanding those differences can help us to communicate and interact more effectively with people from different backgrounds.
Okay, so get ready for a study that's a little creepy. Rosenhan's on being sane in insane places. This one always gets to me.
Yeah, it's a classic study, but it raises some really disturbing questions about the nature of mental illness and the power of labels.
So Rosenhan and his colleagues, they basically pretended to have auditory hallucinations, and they got themselves admitted to psychiatric hospitals.
And once they were in the hospital, they dropped the act and behaved completely normally, but the staff continued to interpret their behavior through the lens of their diagnosis.
It's scary to think about how easily we can be misjudged and how those judgments can have real consequences.
It's a reminder that mental illness is complex, and we need to be careful about making assumptions or applying labels.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about learned helplessness. The idea that when we feel like we have no control over our environment, we can become passive and give up.
Seligman and Mayer demonstrated this with their experiments with dogs. They exposed the dogs to unavoidable electric shocks, and eventually those dogs just stopped trying to escape, even when they had the opportunity.
It's like they had learned that their actions didn't matter, that they were helpless to change their situation.
And this research has been really influential in our understanding of depression and other mental health issues.
It suggests that feeling helpless and hopeless can really contribute to those conditions, and it highlights the importance of fostering a sense of agency and control.
And finally, we come to Calhoun's behavioral sink experiment, which explored the effects of overcrowding on rats.
Yeah, this one's pretty intense. Calhoun created this environment for rats that seemed like paradise,
Yeah.
with unlimited food and water. But as the population grew, things got really dark really fast.
The rats started exhibiting all sorts of dysfunctional behaviors, aggression, social withdrawal, even cannibalism.
It's like they lost all sense of social order.
It's a chilling reminder that even with abundance, overcrowding can lead to social and psychological breakdown.
And it makes you think about the potential implications for humans as our population continues to grow and our cities become more and more crowded.
It's a cautionary tale, for sure.
Wow, we covered a lot of ground today.
We did, from split brains to behavioral sinks. It's incredible how much these studies can teach us about ourselves.
And this is just a small sampling of the amazing research that's been done in the field of psychology.
It's a constantly evolving field with new discoveries being made all the time.
It's exciting to think about what we might learn next.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm ready for a break.
Me too.
Yeah.
We'll be back in a bit with more fascinating insights from the world of psychology.
Yeah, it really highlights how our early experiences, especially in childhood, can have a really huge impact on the way our brains develop. It's like we're building a foundation, and the stronger that foundation is, the more resilient and adaptable that brain's going to be.
That's a great analogy. So it's not just about nature versus nurture. It's really about how those two forces work together to shape who we are. And that brings us to Bouchard and Lichen and their fascinating twin studies.
Right. Those are the studies of identical twins who were separated at birth and then raised in totally different environments.
So it's like nature's perfect experiment to see just how much of our personality, our intelligence, all of that is really determined by our genes. And the results were pretty wild, right?
Oh, they found some really uncanny similarities between these twins, even though they had never met. Some of these twins had the same quirky habits, the same taste in music, even the same names for their pets.
It's those kind of stories that make you wonder about the power of genes. But I know you said earlier that it's not a deterministic view.
Exactly. Our genes don't determine our destiny. Environment still plays a huge role in shaping who we are.
So it's that complex interplay between nature and nurture that makes each of us unique.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about babies again. I love this stuff. Gibson and Walk's visual cliff experiment. This one's a classic, right?
It is. They wanted to see if babies had an innate sense of depth perception.
So they created that clever setup with the visual cliff, that glass surface that looked like a drop-off, even though it was perfectly safe.
Right. And they found that even very young babies were hesitant to crawl over that visual cliff, even when their mothers were encouraging them from the other side.
It's like they instinctively knew it was dangerous, even though they'd never had any negative experiences with heights before.
It suggests that depth perception might be hardwired into us, at least to some extent, which makes sense. Evolutionarily, you don't want babies just tumbling off cliffs.
Right, definitely not.
Yeah.
But so does this mean that we're all born with a fear of heights?
That's where nurture comes in, while the ability to perceive depth that might be there from the beginning, that emotional response of fear, that's probably shaped by experience and social learning.
So it's like our brains are equipped with the hardware, but the software gets updated as we go along.
That's a great way to think about it.
Okay, so speaking of how babies learn, let's talk about Fance's preferential looking technique. This one's so simple, but so brilliant.
Right. They basically figured out what babies are thinking by tracking what they look at. And they found that babies have these preferences from the very beginning.
Like they're drawn to certain things more than others.
Exactly. They love looking at faces, for instance.
Which makes sense. Faces are so important for social interaction. Even before a baby can understand language, they're still picking up on those nonverbal cues from faces.
Absolutely. Faces are packed with information about emotions and intentions, and babies are wired to be really sensitive to those signals.
It makes you wonder if those early face-to-face interactions with caregivers, if those are actually helping to shape the brain's development, especially those parts of the brain that are involved in social and emotional processing.
It's a fascinating question and one that researchers are still exploring, but it definitely highlights the importance of those early interactions between babies and their caregivers.
Now, this next one is about how we make sense of the world around us. Rosh's research on natural categories. This one kind of challenged some traditional views on how we form concepts.
Yeah, it's like, how do we decide what belongs in a certain category? Do we have these really strict definitions in our minds, or is it more fluid and flexible than that?
Yeah, like what makes a bird a bird? Is it just anything that flies?
Right. So Roche found that we tend to rely on these prototypes. Those are the most typical or representative examples of a category when we're making judgments.
So like a robin is a more typical bird than, say, a penguin.
Exactly. Even though they're both technically birds, the robin more closely matches our prototype of what a bird should be.
So it's like our brains are constantly creating these mental shortcuts to help us process information quickly.
Exactly. And those shortcuts can be really helpful, but, they can also lead to biases.
Right, because we might be more likely to notice or remember things that fit our existing ideas about the world, even if those ideas aren't completely accurate.
Exactly. And that can have real world consequences when it comes to things like stereotypes and prejudice. Those are often based on faulty prototypes.
So it's important to be aware of those mental shortcuts
Right.
and how they might be influencing our thinking. Okay, so let's venture into the mysterious world of hypnosis. Is it real? Is it just a stage act? What's going on there?
Well, Spanos argued that a lot of what we see in hypnosis can be explained by the power of suggestion and expectation.
So people aren't really entering an altered state of consciousness. They're just responding to the suggestions of the hypnotist.
Right. It's like they're playing a role and they really want to do it well, even if they're not fully aware of it.
So it's not that hypnosis is fake. It's just that maybe we've been misinterpreting what's actually happening.
Exactly. It speaks to the incredible power of our minds and how easily our behaviors can be shaped by the situation we're in.
Okay, so for something a little lighter, let's talk about Skinner's pigeons and those hilarious superstitious rituals they developed.
Oh, yeah, the pigeons who thought they had to do a little dance to get their food.
So Skinner designed this experiment where he gave the pigeons food at completely random intervals, regardless of what they were doing.
But some of those pigeons started associating those random rewards with whatever they happened to be doing at the time, like flapping their wings or pecking on the corner of the cage.
And then they started doing those things over and over again, as if it was actually controlling the delivery of the food.
It's a perfect example of superstitious behavior. We see it in humans all the time, too. Those lucky charms or rituals we do, even though we know deep down they probably don't really have any effect.
I think it just shows how much we crave a sense of control over our environment, even when things are totally random.
Hmm.
Okay, so Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. This one's classic, but it also reveals some pretty disturbing things about aggression in children.
Absolutely. The kids who watched adults being aggressive towards a Bobo doll, they were much more likely to be aggressive themselves when they had the chance to interact with the doll.
So they learned those aggressive behaviors just by observing someone else.
It highlights the powerful role of observational learning, especially when it comes to something like aggression. Children are constantly watching and imitating the adults around them.
So we need to be really mindful of the messages we're sending them, both through our words and our actions.
Absolutely. Now, this next study, it's all about the power of expectations and how they can shape reality. I'm talking about Rosenthal and Jacobson's Pygmalion in the classroom experiment.
The self-fulfilling prophecy in action. They randomly selected a group of students and told their teachers that those students were expected to show significant intellectual growth over the course of the year.
And the crazy thing is those kids actually did perform better, even though they weren't really any different from the other students.
So just the expectation that they would excel it actually made them excel.
It's the power of belief.
Wow.
If someone believes in you, you're more likely to believe in yourself, and that can lead to real changes in your behavior and your outcomes.
It's like those teachers' positive expectations created this environment where those students could really thrive. Okay, let's move on to intelligence now. Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. I love this one because it challenged that traditional idea that there's only one way to be smart.
Exactly. He argued that we have all these different types of intelligence, like linguistic intelligence, musical intelligence, spatial intelligence, and interpersonal intelligence, just to name a few.
It's like we each have our own unique blend of strengths and weaknesses.
Mhm.
Some people might excel in math, while others are more gifted in music or art.
And by recognizing and nurturing those different intelligences, we can create a much richer and more inclusive learning environment.
It's a much more empowering view of intelligence than that old one-size-fits-all approach. Okay, back to those amazing rats, Tolman's maze experiments. These show that even rats can create mental maps of their environment.
Yeah, remember how they were able to navigate that maze even when new obstacles were introduced? It's like they had this internal representation of the layout in their minds.
So they weren't just mindlessly responding to rewards and punishments. They were actually thinking and planning.
It suggests that even Relatively simple creatures like rats are capable of some pretty sophisticated cognitive processes, things like mental representation and spatial reasoning.
It's a reminder that the world of animal cognition is much more complex and fascinating than we might give it credit for. Okay, so let's talk about memory specifically, how unreliable it can be. Loftus's research on the misinformation effect. This one's a real eye-opener.
Oh, absolutely. She showed that even subtle changes in the way a question is worded or the introduction of new information after an event, it can actually alter our memories of what happened.
It's like our memories aren't these fixed recordings. They're constantly being reconstructed and reshaped every time we access them.
Exactly. And that has huge implications for things like eyewitness testimony. We often think that our memories are accurate, but they can be incredibly fragile and easily influenced by outside factors.
It's a good reminder to be a little more skeptical of our own memories, especially
Yeah.
when it comes to important events. Okay, so speaking of memory and how it forms Harlow's studies with baby monkeys, these were heartbreaking, but they also really underscored the importance of contact comfort in early development.
Those images of those baby monkeys clinging to the soft cloth surrogate mothers, even though they weren't getting any food from those mothers, they're just so powerful and so poignant.
It's like they were craving that physical touch and that emotional connection even more than they were craving food.
It shows just how essential love and affection are for healthy development. Those early bonds are absolutely crucial for our emotional and social well-being.
And without those bonds, those early attachments, it can have some really devastating consequences later in life. Okay, so back to child development. Piaget's observations of infants, they really revolutionized our understanding of how children learn and make sense of the world.
He was a master observer.
Yeah.
He really took the time to watch and understand how babies think, and he came up with those brilliant stages of cognitive development.
And one of his most famous concepts is object permanence. That's the understanding that things continue to exist even when we can't see them.
It seems so obvious to us as adults, but for babies, it's a major cognitive leap. Before they develop object permanence, it's like anything that disappears from their sight, it just ceases to exist.
Like when you play peekaboo with a baby and they act all surprised when you reappear, it's because they genuinely thought you were gone.
It's amazing to watch them develop that understanding of object permanence. It's like a whole new world opens up to them.
Okay, so let's talk about how our sense of right and wrong develops. Kohlberg's research on moral reasoning. He outlined these different stages that we go through as we mature.
Right, so it's not just about learning to follow rules or avoid punishment. It's about developing a deeper understanding of ethical principles and moral reasoning.
So our moral compass is constantly evolving as we grow and learn and encounter new ethical dilemmas.
Exactly. And that evolution is influenced by all sorts of things, our experiences, our relationships, the values we're exposed to.
It's another example of how nature and nurture are constantly interacting to shape who we are. Okay, so this next study is about the importance of choice and control, especially for older adults. Leginer and Rodian's nursing home study. This was pretty fascinating.
They found that giving nursing home residents even small choices, like what they wanted to eat or when they wanted to watch a movie, it had a really big impact on their well-being.
It's like having that sense of autonomy, even over little things.
Yeah.
It can really make a difference in how you feel about yourself and your life.
Absolutely. It shows that having a sense of control over our environment, it's essential for our mental and emotional health. And that's true for people of all ages, not just older adults.
So we all need to feel like we have some agency in our lives. Okay, so now we're going to talk about sex masters and Johnson's research. This was truly groundbreaking stuff.
Their work was revolutionary and controversial at the time. They really pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable to study scientifically.
But they also helped to demystify sex and dispel a lot of the myths and misconceptions that surrounded it.
They mapped out the 4 phases of the sexual response cycle: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. And their research really helped to normalize conversations about sexuality.
And it also led to the development of effective treatments for sexual dysfunction. So
Yeah.
their work has had a really positive impact on countless people's lives.
Absolutely. Now let's explore the world of nonverbal communication. Ekman's cross-cultural studies on facial expressions. These were fascinating.
Yeah, I remember learning about this, the idea that facial expressions of emotion are basically universal.
Right. He found that people all over the world, regardless of their culture and language, they all tend to use the same facial expressions to convey the same emotions.
So a smile means happiness, and a frown means sadness no matter where you go in the world.
It suggests that those basic emotional expressions are hardwired into us. They're part of our shared human heritage.
And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, right?
Right.
Being able to quickly and accurately read those emotional cues on other people's faces, it would have been essential for survival.
It would have helped our ancestors to avoid danger, find mates, and cooperate with each other, so it makes sense that those abilities would have been passed down through generations.
Okay, this next one. It's about that uncomfortable feeling we get when our thoughts and actions don't line up. Cognitive dissonance.
Hmm.
Festinger and Carl Smith's experiment showed how we try to rationalize our behavior to reduce that discomfort.
Oh, yeah. Remember how they had participants do this really tedious and boring task, and then they paid some of them a small amount of money and others a large amount of money to lie and tell someone else that the task was actually fun?
And the people who were paid a small amount, they were the ones who ended up convincing themselves that the task wasn't so bad after all.
It's because they had less justification for lying. So to reduce that cognitive dissonance, they had to actually change their attitude about the task.
So it's like we're motivated to maintain consistency between our beliefs and our actions, and sometimes that means twisting the facts a bit to make ourselves feel better.
It's something we all do to some extent. It's part of what makes us human.
Speaking of beliefs, Rotter's research on locus of control. This one explored how our beliefs about control can influence our lives.
It's that classic question of, are we in control of our own destiny, or are we just at the mercy of fate? Do we see ourselves as the captains of our ships or just passengers along for the ride?
So people with an internal locus of control, they believe that their choices and actions have a real impact on their lives. While people with an external locus of control, they tend to feel like things are mostly outside of their control.
And studies have shown that having an internal locus of control is associated with all sorts of positive outcomes. People with an internal locus of control tend to be more successful in their careers, more proactive about their health, and just generally happier and more satisfied with their lives.
It makes sense, right? If you believe you have the power to change things, you're more likely to take action to make those changes happen.
Now, on the flip side, if you believe that everything is just up to fate or luck, then you might be less likely to put in the effort to achieve your goals.
So it's like our beliefs about control can become self-fulfilling prophecies. Okay, now let's talk about gender roles. Bem's research on androgyny, this one challenged those traditional ideas that masculinity and femininity are two opposite ends of a spectrum.
Right. She argued that we can all possess both masculine and feminine qualities, and that embracing those qualities can actually lead to greater flexibility and well-being.
It's like having more tools in your toolbox. You can be assertive and independent when you need to be, but also nurturing and compassionate in other situations.
And it's about valuing those qualities in ourselves and in others, regardless of gender. Breaking free from those rigid stereotypes can be really liberating.
Okay, so this next study, it's about those driven, high-achieving folks. Those type A personalities we've all heard about. Friedman and Rosman's research actually found a link between those type A behavior patterns and an increased risk of heart disease.
Yeah, they found that type A individuals tend to be more competitive, more time urgent, and more easily frustrated, and those characteristics can lead to chronic stress and elevated levels of those stress hormones.
So it's not just about lifestyle factors like diet and exercise. Our personalities and how we deal with stress can actually have a big impact on our physical health.
It's a reminder that taking care of our mental and emotional well-being is just as important as taking care of our physical health.
Now let's broaden our perspective a bit and talk about culture. Triandis's work on individualistic and collectivist cultures. This one is fascinating.
He explored how different cultures place different emphasis on individual needs and goals versus the needs of the group.
So individualistic cultures like those in the U.S., they tend to prioritize independent self-reliance and personal achievement, while collectivist cultures, those in many parts of Asia, they place more emphasis on interdependence, harmony, and the well-being of the group.
And those cultural values can have a really big impact on how people see themselves, how they relate to others, and even how they experience emotions.
It's a reminder that there are many different ways of being in the world, and that no one culture has a monopoly on truth or wisdom.
Exactly. It's about recognizing and respecting those differences. Okay, so now for a study that really makes you think about the power of labels, Rosenhan's on being sane in insane places.
This one's a classic, but it's also pretty unsettling. They basically had a bunch of sane people pretend to have auditory hallucinations to get themselves admitted to psychiatric hospitals.
And once they were admitted, they dropped the act and behaved completely normally, but the staff still interpreted their behavior through the lens of their diagnosis.
It's scary to think that even perfectly sane people can be misdiagnosed and labeled as mentally ill. And once you have that label, it can be really hard to shake.
It highlights the importance of being really careful about applying labels and making sure that we're treating people as individuals rather than just categories or diagnoses.
Okay, let's talk about learned helplessness. The idea that when we feel like we have no control over a situation, we can just give up and become passive.
Seligman and Mayer demonstrated this so powerfully with their experiments with dogs. They exposed those dogs to unavoidable electric shocks, and eventually those dogs just stopped trying to escape even when they had the opportunity to do so.
It's like they had learned that their actions didn't matter, that they were powerless to change their situation.
And that sense of helplessness, it can have a devastating impact on our motivation, our well-being, and even our physical health.
It's one of the key factors that contributes to depression and other mental health issues.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that fostering a sense of agency and control, it's essential for our well-being. Okay, so our last study for this segment, Calhoun's behavioral sync experiment, this one looked at the effects of overcrowding on rats, and the results were pretty dystopian.
I remember reading about this. It's like they created this rat utopia,
Yeah.
with unlimited food and water and nesting materials. But as the population grew, things took a really dark turn.
Right. Even though those rats had everything they needed, they started exhibiting all sorts of dysfunctional behaviors, aggression, social withdrawal, even cannibalism.
It's a pretty stark illustration of what can happen when population density gets too high, even in a seemingly ideal environment.
It raises some important questions about the potential impact of overcrowding on human behavior and well-being,
Yeah.
especially as our cities continue to grow and become more densely populated.
It's definitely a reminder that we need to be mindful of the impact of our environment on our behavior, both individually and collectively. All right, so we're back and ready to dive into the final set of studies for today's deep dive.
These last few studies really highlight how powerful the situation can be and how our behavior can be influenced by factors that we're not even aware of.
Okay, so let's jump right in with Calhoun's behavioral sync experiment, the one with the rats, and it always gives me chills.
Yeah, that one's a classic, and it's pretty unsettling.
So Calhoun basically created this, like, paradise for rats. They had all the food and water and nesting materials they could ever want.
It was like a rodent utopia.
Exactly. But as the rat population grew, things took a dark turn.
Despite having everything they needed, those rats started exhibiting all sorts of dysfunctional behaviors. They became aggressive, they withdrew from social interaction, and some even resorted to cannibalism.
It's a pretty disturbing reminder that even in a seemingly ideal environment, overcrowding can have a huge impact on social dynamics and well-being.
And it makes you think about the potential implications for humans, as our cities continue to grow and we face increasing population density.
Definitely something to think about.
Okay.
So let's shift gears to something a little more uplifting now. The effectiveness of therapy. Smith and Glass's meta-analysis gave us some really compelling data on this.
Yeah, they analyzed data from hundreds of studies and found that psychotherapy across a wide range of approaches is significantly more effective than no treatment.
So talking to a therapist can actually make a difference.
Absolutely. And what's even more interesting is that they found different types of therapy tend to be equally effective.
So it's not so much about finding the right therapy, it's more about finding the right therapist.
That's right. It's about finding someone you feel comfortable with, someone you trust, and who you feel understands you.
The therapeutic relationship is key. Okay, so let's talk about phobias now. Those intense and often irrational fears that can really hold us back. Wolpe's systematic desensitization. This offers a really practical approach to overcoming phobias.
Yeah, it's a gradual process that involves slowly exposing yourself to the thing you fear while using relaxation techniques to manage your anxiety.
So instead of just throwing someone in a room full of spiders, you would slowly introduce them to their fear step by step.
Exactly. The goal is to gradually desensitize the person to the thing they fear so that it no longer triggers that intense anxiety response.
So it's about rewiring the brain's response to the feared object.
Exactly. Okay, so now let's delve into the world of projective tests, those psychological assessments that try to uncover our hidden thoughts and motives, starting with the famous Rorschach ink blot test.
Those ink blots have always intrigued me. What's the theory behind them?
The idea is that by asking someone to interpret these ambiguous images, we can get a glimpse into their unconscious processes, their thoughts, feelings, and motivations that they might not even be aware of.
So it's not about finding the right answer. It's about exploring the unique way each person makes sense of the world.
Exactly. And the way someone interprets those ink blots can provide clues about their personality, their emotional state, their coping mechanisms.
Okay, so another projective technique, the thematic apperception test, or TAT-TE.
This one uses pictures of ambiguous scenes, and the person is asked to tell a story about what's happening in the picture.
So it's like creating your own little narratives.
And those narratives can reveal a lot about the person's underlying needs, conflicts, and relationships.
Okay, so now let's revisit a study that really sent shockwaves through the psychology world. Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment.
Oh, yeah, this one was controversial, but it really highlights the power of the situation to influence our behavior.
So Zimbardo created this mock prison and randomly assigned participants to be either guards or prisoners.
And within days, the guards started acting in really authoritarian and even abusive ways, while the prisoners became passive and submissive.
It's like they all got caught up in their roles.
It shows how easily we can conform to the expectations of a situation, even if those expectations go against our own values and beliefs.
And it raises some really important questions about the ethics of research and the need to protect participants from harm.
Absolutely. Okay, so next up, Ash's line judgment experiment. This one demonstrates the power of conformity in a really simple but effective way.
Yeah, I remember this one. Participants had to judge the length of lines, and it seemed like a pretty easy task.
But Ash planted actors in the group who intentionally gave the wrong answer.
And a surprising number of the real participants conformed to the group and gave the wrong answer too, even though they knew it was wrong.
It shows how much we want to fit in with the group, even if it means going against our own better judgment.
Okay, so let's talk about the bystander effect now, that unsettling phenomenon where people are less likely to help someone in need if there are other people around.
Darley and Letané did a series of studies on this and found that the more bystanders there are, the less likely anyone is to take action.
It's like we all assume someone else will step up so we don't have to.
And that diffusion of responsibility can have really tragic consequences.
It's a reminder that we need to be proactive and take personal responsibility for helping others, even when other people are present.
And finally, we come to one of the most controversial and thought-provoking studies in psychology, Milgram's obedience experiments.
This research explored how far people would go in obeying authority, even if it meant harming another person.
Milgram found that a surprisingly high percentage of participants were willing to deliver what they believed to be painful electric shocks to another person simply because the experimenter told them to.
A really disturbing finding, and it raises some really profound questions about the nature of human obedience and the conditions under which we're willing to inflict harm on others.
It's a stark reminder that we all have the capacity for both good and evil, and that we need to be constantly vigilant in guarding against the forces that can lead us to do things we never thought we were capable of.
Wow, what an incredible journey through the world of psychology research. We've covered so much ground today.
It's amazing to think about how much we've learned about the human mind over the past century.
From split-brain patients to superstitious pigeons, from visual cliffs to behavioral sinks, these studies have revealed the incredible complexity and often the paradoxical nature of human behavior.
And yet, despite all that we've learned, there's still so much we don't know about the brain and how it works.
That's what makes psychology so fascinating. It's a never-ending quest for understanding.
And as we continue to learn more about ourselves, we also have the opportunity to create a more just compassionate and humane world.
So keep those minds engaged, keep asking those tough questions, and keep exploring the vast and fascinating world of human behavior. There's always more to discover.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of psychology research.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those conversations